housekeeping rules, and Zoom etiquette. Welcome to our Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in collaboration with the College of Extend International. It is an exciting time, and especially given to the pandemic and given to what's happening right now. Oops, we have this important talk scheduled. Now, before we get started, as courtesy reminder, please mute your microphone. This is just so that the background noise will not interrupt the talk. This is a 45-minute talk. If you do have a question, please feel free to use the chat. The chat is located at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, we encourage you to use the chat room. Moving forward, this presentation will be recorded for university purposes, and it will be streamed live on Facebook. Also, we encourage everyone to please stay towards the end of the presentation. After the 45-minute talk, we're going to have an open discussion with our presenter today and our audience guests. And we also kindly ask of you to please complete a course evaluation. This is just for us to get your feedback in regarding to today's event. This link will be posted in the chat. Other than that, ladies and gentlemen, that is it at my end. I do want to briefly introduce Dr. Hamud Salehi. He is our Associate Dean of International Education and Senior International Officer and Professor of Political Science, Dr. Hamud Salehi.
Thank you, Hema. I don't know how to introduce Mitch, except to say we're so glad you are here, Mitch. Everybody knows you on campus. Everybody is happy to see you, and we really, really miss you. But let me give a brief background of how you connected to the university and what you're doing now, and then I'll give you you get the floor to entertain us with this important topic. So Mitch was our acting provost on campus, and also a vice president of academic affairs for student success. He was the dean of the College of Professional Studies and Health and Human Resources. He was also acting dean at one point at the other campus in Cal State LA. And before that, he was assistant professor in the Department of Social Welfare at UCLA. While on our campus, everybody remembers Mitch, how nice he was, how professional he was, and how he led the university on major initiative, including, and the most important one, is the 5 academic college strategic leadership plan that he led. He is a highly sought after international speaker on the Japanese-American redress movement and its relevance to contemporary sociopolitical issues. He is considered as as a leading scholar in this area. Now, these days, Mitch, as we all know, left us for what it appears to be a nice job or a nice retirement thing. I don't know if it's a retirement or it's actually a job, but he's enjoying himself very, very much as president and CEO of the Go for Broke National Education Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the legacy and lessons of the Nazi Second World War veterans. Dr. Maki is the lead author of the award-winning book, Achieving the Impossible Dream, How Japanese Americans Obtained Redress. This is a detailed case study of the 1988 Civil Liberties Act. It is a critically acclaimed book, documents the redress movement from its early roots during World War II, the formal introduction of the idea in the 1970s, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilian, the judicial battles during the 1980s, and the lobbying of the legislative and executive branch in the 80s and 90s. In 2000, the book received the Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Award which is given to books addressing bigotry and human rights in North America. Dr. Maki received his doctorate degree and master's degree in social work and a bachelor's degree in public affairs from the University of Southern California. So I really don't understand when he went and teach at UCLA. That's so disloyal. He's a licensed clinical social worker who has worked for the County of Riverside, DPSS, El Centro Human Services, and Daniel Freeman and Marina Hospital. It's really a true pleasure, Mitch, for agreeing to do this for us. I think this is the best event that we on campus have had, and we really had some pretty good one. So thank you. The floor is yours. You're muted.
Here we go. All right, can everyone hear me? First of all, let me just say that I told Hamud just to say I was a nice guy and forget all that other stuff. But it is a delight to be back on campus, even if it's virtually. It's as you were all entering the rooms, I could see the names of the people coming in: Mary, Michael, Gus, Patricia, Lisa, Pam, Cheryl, Mary Lou. I wish I could see you all right now, but it's so nice to be, as we always said, once a Toro, always a Toro. Delighted to be back here with you all. So let me start off by saying that when Hamud called me, and first of all, thank you, Dr. Salehi, for calling me and inviting me. It certainly is an honor for me to be asked to come back and speak to our family here at Cal State Dominguez Hills. But when Dr. Salehi reached out to me and asked me to come and speak, I said, of course, I would come. And then the next thing I know, I saw the flyer that's with the title of "Why Are Minorities Being Targeted in Our American Democracy?" And my response was, yeah, that's a great topic. I want to go hear about that. And I'm the one that's supposed to be talking about it. And the truth is, I don't know any more than you know as to why this continues to happen in our nation. And it has always happened in our nation. Racism and discrimination against all people, based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, has been a part of our nation for forever. And I think the challenge that we really need to come together here today and as a nation is to say, well, how do we begin to change that? How do we begin to permanently change that, if at all possible? And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And I'd like to start off by sharing with you a short public service announcement that I had the privilege of being a part of. A&E TV came out and did this PSA. It's 60 seconds long, so I'm going to share it with you. And it's now playing on A&E as well as the History Channel and the Discovery Channel. So let's see if I can do this. We will share sound, optimize video, and here we go. Go up one. Okay. Need to hide closing controls. Make this. How am I doing, Nicole? Am I getting it all done right?
You are.
Okay, here we go. Here's the public service announcement.
National Education Center, we tell the story.
Your video is blocked.
Hold on, let's stop it. Your video, Anissa?
Yes, the video is currently blocked. There's something in front of your screen. In front
Dr.
of the video.
Maki, remember to remove the video control, the panel control. Let's do that.
Okay, show video panel. Hide video panel. Hide. Okay, am I good now?
You may need to reshare.
I'll stop his sharing. Okay, let's do that once again, Dr. Maki.
Try it again. Okay, so I hit share sound and optimize the video clip. And I will try this. How does it look now?
Perfect. Oh.
Okay, can I play it?
Yes.
Yes.
At Go for Broke National Education Center, we tell the story of the Japanese American soldiers of World War II. The Nisei soldiers like Yosh Nakamura were fighting not only the enemy, but the perception that they weren't true Americans. They were fighting against racial prejudice back home to demonstrate that they had a rightful place in American society. When I was growing up and I learned about the history of our nation, it was primarily white stories, white faces, and white heroes. But the truth is, our nation has been built by people of all colors, of all backgrounds. And it's important that we tell these stories so that all Americans can appreciate what each other has done to make our nation as great as it is.
For more voices impacting our culture and their communities, visit aetv.com/voicesmagnified.
Okay, I'm trying to find myself. Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you, and we're gonna stop share for a second so you can reshare.
Let me come back on and then I will share my PowerPoint in a moment. Okay, so I share that because to me, that public service announcement was pretty benign. Yeah, it's pretty much saying all people have had a place in America. And I have to tell you that about a week and a half ago, I received the most hateful email that I have ever received in my career. I mean, this individual used every four-letter word he could, told me to do terrible things to myself, and essentially called me a racist and said that I was part of the problem in America. And quite frankly, that was very disturbing to me because I thought, as I mentioned, that the PSA was a rather benign message. And what was scary is the thought that while it was only one email, what did it represent? Hundreds of other people thinking that way, thousands of other people thinking that way, or possibly even more. And so as I thought about what is our role in addressing the hatred, the discrimination, the racism that is spreading across our nation, that's the message that I wanted to talk to you all about here today. Because as a university setting, we all know that education is the most powerful tool, and that education is what we all in this room can do to contribute to the change in America that needs to continue to happen. And my message to all of us is it's important for us, if we're going to change the dynamic of minorities or any people being targeted in our nation, is that each and every one of us has a responsibility to tell our stories, to tell stories of our communities, of our people, and of our experiences. And so that's my challenge and my hope that all of us can do. And so that's what I'm going to do today, is share with you the Japanese American story in this light of anti-Asian hate that is spreading across the nation right now. So let's see, we'll go here. So at Go for Broke National Education Center, and Nicole, everybody can still hear me? Am I still good?
Yes, you're great.
Okay.
You remove your floating panel. There you go.
Okay, very good. All right, now I can't see anybody, so I'll just talk to my screen and I'll take questions at the end. But anyway, at Go for Broke National Education Center, we stand in strong opposition to the anti-Asian hate which is spreading across our nation. But we also realize that anti-Asian hate, as well as hate and racism against people of color, against people of different religions, gender, sexual orientation, has been with us for a very long time. And that in this case, as I tell the Japanese American story, that Asian Americans and Japanese Americans have time and time again demonstrated that being an American is not a matter of the color of one's skin, but truly the matter of the content of one's character. So let me share with you our story and how we have faced racism and continue to combat this. Let's go back to December 7th, 1941. The imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and it thrust the United States into World War II. Japanese Americans began to wonder immediately, what would happen to us? Would we be treated like the American citizens we were, 2/3 of whom had been born in America, the other third having been here 20, 30, 40 years. We were loyal American citizens. Or would we be treated like the enemy because we shared a common ancestry? Well, we got our answer 2 months later when Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And this set the underpinnings by which nearly 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry would be forcibly removed from the West Coast and sent to concentration camps across the United States. It was a time of extreme racism in our nation. It was the old as well as the young who were sent off. We lost our homes, we lost our jobs, we lost our communities, but most of all, what was lost was a sense of place at the American table of citizenship. And while living in these camps, Japanese American families were forced to live in communal settings, in desolate areas, surrounded by barbed wire, machine gun towers. But worst of all, what was lost was the constitutional rights. And then a curious thing happened about a year into the incarceration. The US Army realized that the war effort was going poorly in Europe, and they needed more men, literally men, to go and fight. So they decided to create a segregated Japanese American unit made up of Japanese American young men, boys really, 18, 19, 20 years old. And I'd like you to stop and imagine the angst and the anxiety that this caused for Japanese American families as they were asked to send their sons halfway across the world to fight for liberty and justice while their own families were being incarcerated and denied their constitutional rights. The issue tore the community apart, as you can imagine, as families would say, hell no, you're not going to go, or this is the way we prove we're American. At first, the decision was a voluntary one as the Army asked for volunteers. And on the first day that they put out the call for volunteers, 10,000 young men from Hawaii signed up. It's important to keep in mind that the Japanese Americans in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor was, that had been attacked, were not incarcerated, were not forcibly removed from their homes. But on the mainland, where families were forcibly sent to camp, on that first day, only 1,200 Japanese American men would sign. Eventually, 33,000 young Japanese American men and several hundred Japanese American women would serve in the American military. They would go on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history. In Europe, they were known as the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They were to be awarded 21 Medals of Honor, 7 presidential citations, and over 4,000 Purple Hearts, the medal that you receive when you are wounded or killed. About 2 years ago, my daughter and I had the opportunity to travel to northern France, where the 442nd engaged in one of its most vicious battles. And this is a photo of the forest near Bruyères, the town close by the battle. It was October 1944. And this is a photo from that time. And it's eerie to see that not much has changed in that forest. October 1944, there was a battalion of white American soldiers from the 141st that had been trapped by the Nazi soldiers, surrounded by 6,000 Nazi troops. And they were being bombarded every day, slowly being starved to death and the Nazis tightening their noose around the battalion. The US Army tried to send in several battalions to save these soldiers, but none could break through. Finally, they said, let's send in the 442nd. The 442nd understood that this was a suicide mission, that many of them would not walk out alive, but they also understood that the eyes of a nation were upon them. They broke through the Nazi lines. They saved those 211 white American soldiers, and in the process took over 300 casualties. That was the math of the day. Another story about the 442nd is that towards the end of the war, the artillery unit of the 442nd broke off and with other units started chasing the Nazis back into Germany. And as they moved north, the 522nd, the artillery of the 442nd, stumbled upon an installation, a camp. They didn't know what it was. It was in the middle of the winter, there was snow on the ground, and as they approached the camp, they saw bumps on the ground, which they thought were logs covered by snow. When they approached these bumps on the ground, they realized they weren't logs. They were human bodies, the frozen bodies of Lithuanian Jews. And they had just discovered a satellite of Dachau. They threw the gates open and they liberated the Lithuanian Jews that still remained in that satellite camp. Imagine the irony of these young Japanese Americans who are liberating Jews halfway across the world from a concentration camp, while their own families are back home behind barbed wire, being denied their constitutional rights. The Army realized that this was not good public relations and refused to have any photos taken of the Japanese American soldiers liberating that camp. They waited 24 hours until a white unit came in, and that's when the photos were taken of the liberation of Dachau. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese Americans who could speak Japanese served as linguists, as translators, and as interpreters. And they were credited with helping to end the war 2 years earlier than otherwise would have happened, saving countless lives on both sides of the Pacific. They participated in every major battle that the US Marines participated in the Pacific. They were undercover agents in the Philippines. They fought behind enemy lines with Merrill's Marauders in Burma. They experienced jungle warfare in New Guinea, and they landed with the Marines at Iwo Jima. And in Saipan, they were given the assignment of crawling into caves to talk Japanese soldiers out of the caves and have them surrender. So they certainly were in harm's way. Many of the Nisei MIS soldiers also served as translators and interpreters during the war trial crimes after World War II. They also were very instrumental in creating the new Japanese constitution that ushered Japan into the post-World War II era. So the question is why? Why did these young men go off, put themselves in harm's way, really in death's way, when their own families were being denied civil liberties and equal treatment under the law in America? The best answer comes from a young sergeant named Kazuo Masuda. I think Sergeant Masuda spoke for many of the Nisei soldiers when he was asked, why are you doing this? Why are you putting yourself in harm's way when your family is being treated the way they are? His answer was, because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance. Right or wrong, agree with him or not, Sergeant Masuda and the Japanese American soldiers of World War II understood that in 1943, 1944, and 1945, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. 1945 comes along, the camps close, Japanese Americans are given $25 and a one-way train ticket to go and reestablish their lives. And when they left camp, they didn't leave camp saying, oh, we need to start a redress movement or a reparations movement. You know, they had the everyday concerns. Let's put a roof over our head. Let's get a job. Let's put food on the table. Let's get the kids back in school. The things that all of us would be concerned about as we are starting over. But there was another feeling that Japanese Americans had at that time, and that was a feeling of shame, a feeling that somehow we had done something wrong to cause this terrible violation of the Constitution, this terrible tragedy to be imposed upon us. And the best analogy I can give you is that of a sexual assault victim or an incest survivor who, through no fault of their own, had something terrible happen to them. And they blamed themselves. If only I had done this, if only I had said this, if only, if only, if only. It is an example of oppression, of identification with the oppressor. And so for many Japanese Americans, the feeling was, let's be 110% American. Let's be so American that this will never happen to us again. The 1950s comes along and America begins to change. In 1952, we have the Mccarran Walters Act, which allows Asian Americans, Japanese Americans in particular, to naturalize for the first time. Earlier, I had said that 2/3 of the folks that were sent to camp were American citizens by birth. The other third, the first generation, who had been here 20, 30, 40 years, were prohibited by law from naturalizing. And that didn't change until 1952. 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education, and separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. In the 1950s, the civil rights movement begins. And then something happens in 1959, something that sets the stage for the possibility that Japanese Americans may someday have their story told at the highest levels of government. Anybody have a guess? You can think to yourself, what happens in 1959 that gives Japanese Americans a ray of hope? And that is that Hawaii becomes the 50th state. And with that status of being a state comes representation. 2 senators and 1 U.S. representative at the time. In fact, the first U.S. representative from the now new state of Hawaii was a young man named Daniel K. Inouye. Daniel Inouye was a member of the 442nd. He lost his right arm in battle fighting for his nation. What better symbol of loyalty to send to the U.S. Congress than a soldier like Daniel? The 1960s comes along, and with it, even more change. The civil rights movement is in full bloom. The women's movement begins to capture the imagination of young people across the nation. The anti-Vietnam War movement is in full bloom also. And young people are learning how to say, hell no, I won't go. And dissent becomes an American value. Also during this time, the ethnic studies programs begin to emerge in America. And young students of color, including Asian Americans, begin to take a look at their own stories, their own histories. And for Asian Americans, Japanese Americans in particular, they look back at World War II and they began to ask, what happened? Why didn't my parents and my grandparents resist? We would have resisted, and they began to look at their parents and their grandparents through the lens of accommodation and cowardice, because the stories hadn't been told and they didn't understand that it was a different time and a different place. But even with this growing awareness, the Japanese American community was a long ways away from wanting to demand an apology and monetary redress payments for the wrong that had been committed during World War II. And as an example, in 1963, UCLA, yes, the university that I went to after I graduated from USC, Hamud, there was a professor. I wasn't around in 1963 there, though. In 1963, there was a professor named Roger Daniels, and he had a history class. His first assignment was to give his students the assignment of writing an autobiography. So they all wrote their autobiographies, they turned it in, and he had two young sansei, third generation Japanese Americans. These would be the children of those who had been in camp. Or, as you'll see in the story, that they were old enough to have been in camp. So both of them started off their autobiography by saying, I was born in 1943 in Los Angeles, blah, 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 blah. Dr. Daniels read that and he knew that there was a problem, and he called both of them into his office and he said, there's a problem with your autobiographies. And they looked at him and they said, we didn't cheat, Dr. Daniels. I mean, how do you cheat on an autobiography, right? So he said, that's not what I'm talking about. Go home, show your autobiographies to your parents, come back and see me. And sure enough, one of the young students came back the next day and he said, you're right, Dr. Daniels. I showed my autobiography to my parents. I was born in 1943, but I wasn't born in Los Angeles. I was born in Manzanar, an American concentration. The pain, the shame, the wanting to forget was so powerful for some families that they didn't even tell their children the truth about where they were born. The 1970s comes into play, and we start to get more representation in the US Congress. Representative Inoue is now Senator Inoue. And in 1974, Norman Mineta, the mayor of San Jose, California, is elected to the US House of Representatives. Norm was a 10-year-old boy when he and his family were sent off to Heart Mountain concentration camp. In 1976, Spark Matsunaga is elected to the US Senate. Spark was a decorated World War II veteran of the 100th. In 1978, Bob Matsui is elected to the House of Representatives from Sacramento, California. Bob was a 6-month-old baby when he and his family were sent off to Tule Lake concentration camp. So in the late 70s, we have 2 decorated war veterans and 2 former inmates of an American concentration camp in the US Congress. But the community was still a long ways away from speaking with a unified voice on what they wanted to do. And there basically was 3 trains of thought. The first group said, let it go. Forget what happened to us. We don't want to have to remember those stories. It was primarily the elderly who felt this way. When I spoke to many of them, they would say, don't make me remember that time. Don't make me retell those stories. Don't make me refeel those moments. And I remember I was a young college student in the late 70s, early 80s, and I was talking to a woman who at the time I considered to be elderly. I think she was only about 64. Doesn't sound so elderly to me anymore. But I remember asking her, don't you think this redress movement is great? And she said to me, no, I don't. And I said, why? And she said, I work for the federal government now. I'm going to retire in a couple of years. I don't want them getting mad at us again and taking away my pension. And I immediately wanted to say, that's crazy. They'd never do that. And then I realized this was a woman who had had her whole life turned upside down. The government had taken much more than just a pension away. They took her family's house away. They took the property away. They took the business away. They incarcerated her and her family. Who was I as a young 18-year-old kid to tell her how to feel and what was right and what was wrong? And it was a very humbling experience for me as in reliving our story, is understanding that we have to be very cognizant and very sensitive to how our elders view that story. The second group said, wait a second, something wrong happened to us. We are deserving of an apology, a good, clean apology. And there was a very pragmatic part of this perspective, which was the idea of asking for money from the American government was the impossible dream. There's no way that could ever happen. An apology and money had never happened, and that was dreaming. But there was also a very principled reason why some people felt this way. And that feeling was, Don't take away my civil liberties, my constitutional rights, then throw a few $1,000s at me and say everything is okay. Don't insult me like that. Don't put a price tag on my civil liberties. Just give me a good, clean apology. And then there was a third group that said, wait a second. Yes, we are deserving of an apology. But let's face it, folks, they didn't just call us names and hurt our feelings. There were real losses. People lost their homes, their jobs, their businesses, their opportunities to go on for school. There were real losses. And if you want to make this apology authentic, you need to attach money to it. In the late 70s, 1978, the Japanese American Citizens League passed its most strongly worded proclamation that demanded an apology and demanded monetary reparations to go along with that apology. And thus began the fight to make this issue something that American legislators, American federal legislators would understand. And the fight began with a federal commission. It was the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And this commission traveled the nation. It heard testimony from 750 individuals from 10 different cities, both the people who lived in the camps, as well as the individuals who were still alive that helped create those camps. You have to remember, this was a community that just 10 years earlier had difficulty telling their children the truth about where they were born. In San Jose, I had a friend, Richard Katsuda, who was working with the elderly. And he wanted to convince them to go and speak at the commission hearing in San Francisco. They all said, no, we can't. Because for them, going before a federal commission and speaking was like going before the pearly gates of heaven and telling God, you gave me a bad life. It was just too intimidating. So he said to them, if not for yourself, then koromo no tameni, for the sake of your children, for the sake of your grandchildren, go and tell your story. He said he convinced 6 of them to go to San Francisco, and on the van ride over there from San Jose, you could hear a pin drop as these individuals were petrified about what they were about to do. They went to San Francisco, they testified, they gave their testimony to the commission. And he said on the way back to San Jose, all you could hear in the van was laughing and singing and them slapping each other on the back as they knew they had begun to face their demons. I was a young college student at that time, and I attended the Los Angeles hearing. And this is a photo of the Los Angeles hearing. There were 3 other rooms where the sound was piped into. And if I could point out to all of you where I am, you can actually see me in this photo as a young college student. I will never forget the testimony of that day as our community found the strength and the voice to begin to tell its story. And I could tell you stories all day long, but let me share just one with you. And it's a story of a gentleman named Kiyoshi Sonoda. And Kiyoshi Sonoda was a dentist, so we'll call him Dr. Sonoda. And he testified that because he had some medical training, when he was sent off to camp, he was put in charge of the infirmary. And he described his first patient, a young, dehydrated infant. And Dr. Sonoda said that under normal circumstances, he would be able to treat that baby and make him well. But because he didn't have the proper supplies or the proper equipment, all he could do was hold that infant in his hands and feel his last twitch before he died. And as he told this story, Dr. Sonoda had tears streaming down his face. And his wife was sitting in the audience, and she said, Kiyoshi is crying. Kiyoshi doesn't cry. Kiyoshi didn't even cry at his own father's funeral. But on this day, Dr. Sonoda did cry, and a room full of people, including myself, cried with him. And as powerful as those testimonies were, I would submit to you that the more powerful testimony actually occurred.
네네네네, 언니. 네네네, 빨리 들어와.
Okay. The more powerful testimony actually occurred in people's homes as the young Sansei, third generation, would ask their parents and their grandparents, tell us what happened. Tell us what it was really like. And their parents and grandparents would tell them their stories, sometime for the very first time. And in response, the parents and grandparents would ask their young activist grandchildren, can we really win this redress movement? Can we really get an apology? And the answer was, we don't know, but we have to try. The commission issued its findings in a book called Personal Justice Denied. They determined that the camps were wrong and that the camps were the result of, quote, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Let me say those words again. Race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. When does that sound like? When I share that with students today, they say, it sounds like today. Race prejudice, I don't have to belabor that point with this group. War hysteria, we are at war with terrorism, both domestic and international, and we see it. And yet we have to, while we have to be vigilant to maintain our own safety, we also have to be vigilant to maintain our own values and our own civil liberties and our commitment to the Constitution. And a failure of political leadership. When we see what's happening in Washington, D.C. and the Congress and how divided our Congress is, that's not political leadership, that's partisanship, that's divisiveness. And I think we as Americans can do better and need to find that common ground where race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership doesn't lead us down the same terrible path. The battle continues after the commission to the Congress. September 17th, 1987, the bill is argued on the floor of the House of Representatives. And this day was chosen specifically because it was the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. And on that day, the impossible dream of obtaining legislation that would provide an apology and reparations passes the House of Representatives. 243 US representatives voted in favor of this bill. 180 of them were Democrats. 63 of them were Republicans. Truly a bipartisan effort. The bill then moves on to the US Senate, and we knew it would pass because Senator Matsunaga had lined up 71 co-sponsors. He had personally lobbied all the other senators, and 71 of them signed on. So it was a slam dunk to pass there. So now we needed only one more supporter, one more signature, one more person to make this apology bill a reality. That, of course, is the President of the United States. And so for those of you who remember 1988, you'll remember that the president was none other than Ronald Reagan, a very conservative president whose own administration had been fighting against the redress movement and the redress concept, both in the courts as well as in the Congress. For many of us, we thought there's no way Ronald Reagan would sign this bill. But for those of you who remember Ronald Reagan, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. He had the ability to tell stories that would touch people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. Well, the opposite was true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate working with you. The question was, what story could we tell the president that would make him understand this issue on a personal? Well, remember I told you the story of Kazuo Masuda, the young sergeant who said that he was fighting because it was the only way that he knew that he could have, his family could have a chance in America. 2 weeks after saying that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle, fighting for his nation, the United States of America. After the war, his family moves back to Santa Ana, California, and they're met with hate speech, racial taunt, and threats of bodily harm. Hate speech, racial threat, threats of bodily harm. Doesn't sound so different from today. The Army, realizing that this was a PR fiasco, that one of its own fallen heroes, his own family couldn't even move home, sent out a contingent of Army officers to have the medal ceremony, including a four-star General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who had fought in the Pacific and had been very outspoken against the anti-Japanese hate that was still in the United States. Later that day, at a United America rally, there was a young white American captain who addressed the audience. His name was Ronald Reagan. Captain Reagan addressed the audience by saying, "The blood that is soaked into the sands is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family to another for what your son Kazuo did. Thank you." That story was relayed to the president in the 80s, and his response was, "I remember what those soldiers did for America." On August 10th, 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which granted an apology and monetary redress payments to those affected by Executive Order 9. It was a great moment, not only for Japanese Americans, but truly for all Americans who value the Constitution and who value the ideas of liberty and justice. As I close my formal remarks, unless I leave any of us with the feeling that justice has been permanently secured, let me leave you with the words of the late Supreme Court Justice, Antonin Scalia. Justice Scalia said, "What happened to the Japanese Americans was wrong, but you are kidding yourself if you think it will never happen again. In times of war, the laws fall silent." In times of war, the laws fall silent. Very chilling words for any of us here today who value the rule of law and who value the Constitution of our nation. And so as I close today, I hope you'll take to heart and join me in making sure that each of us begins to tell our stories of our communities, of our people, of our experiences, and that all of us commit ourselves to never again in our nation shall we allow the laws to fall silent. Thank you all for sharing this time with me.
Thank you so much, Mitch. This was really amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. We learned a great deal. We have 2 questions in the audience. I have Dr. Gus Martin. Gus Martin, would you like to ask the question yourself, or you want?
Who is that? Gus who?
Somebody.
Are very close friends.
Gus, are you there? Would you like to ask a question?
Much. Thank you, Mitch. That was absolutely brilliant and very encouraging for all of us. So I'll just read my question that I put into the comments. The current environment is one of racial tension and overt racial confrontation. The question is whether a solution can be identified that will promote cultural healing. So can you comment on the concept of a truth and reconciliation process? South Africa, Canada, and a few other nations adopted truth and reconciliation to correct past injustices. In the US, it would be quite uncomfortable addressing injustices to Indigenous people, African Americans, and others. So, should truth and reconciliation be advocated? Is it a feasible policy option?
Yes. You ask a yes/no question, Gus, you're going to get a yes/no answer. But
which I appreciate.
Yes, no. Actually, that is such a complicated question, and with so many layers, as I know you understand that. Of course, I personally believe we need to go down that path of, as a nation, looking at the past wrongs, not only against Japanese Americans, but against all the peoples who have suffered in our nation to make our nation what it is today. I think the foremost question is, what shape, what form would that truth and reconciliation take, that commission or that process? And while it happened in South Africa, the South African experience is much different than what we've seen here in the United States. You know, where half our nation right now would say we did nothing wrong. You know, half our nation would say we have nothing to apologize for, which is a very different situation than was the case in South Africa at the time that Nelson Mandela was released and they pursued the truth and reconciliation. I just sat in on a 2-day workshop where a number of people from the United States were having this discussion, and it really boils down to, you know, how do you begin to structure this, and how do you begin to introduce the concept so that it's not just the choir preaching to itself. You know, because if we only get half the nation to say, let's do a truth and reconciliation process, and the other half who doesn't believe in it stays out of it, then we're really not reconciling anything. We're just having a pep rally, if you will. You know, the question begins, how do we begin to talk to the other? You know, and that is such a complicated discussion. And I know, having spent time at Dominguez Hills, that in some ways, even on our campus, we lived in a bubble. You know, because much of the thinking on campus is very progressive and so forth, but it's so different than if you take it to another part of the country where the thinking is 180 degrees different. You know, so for many of our students at a place like Dominguez Hills, you know, they talk amongst each other, and it really becomes the choir talking to the choir. And I'm thinking, how do we begin to have true exchanges between places like Dominguez Hills and other sources of progressive thinking with folks that don't think that way, with very conservative thinking, with thinking that of, you know, there's nothing wrong with how our nation was formed. Because the truth is, unless we have that reconciliation between these very opposite perspectives, we're not going to be, a formal truth and reconciliation process doesn't really do us much good.
Thank you, Mitch. We have a few other questions in the chat. Mimi asks Dr. Maki, do you agree that the people of color in the United States face racial discrimination, facing racial discrimination is responsible, or is the responsibility coming from DC? She cites the example of the Chinese Exclusive Act and the suffering of African Americans. I guess the issue, what Mimi is asking, the political leadership that you refer to, the work that NACI Group worked through the House of Representatives, through the Senate and the President to get the apology. she's looking from that perspective. What do you think? Yeah.
Clearly, the federal government plays a large role in the promotion of discriminatory bias and practices. Yeah, and our history is replete with this in terms of, what I didn't share is that even before World War II, it was the Japanese American experience. There were anti-miscegenation laws. Those are state laws saying who you can marry, who you couldn't marry. Japanese and Asian Americans were prohibited from owning land in certain places. And as was mentioned in the question, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And those are just a few examples. And every group can identify federal legislation that has been discriminatory and promoting bias. And, I will point out too that the most recent presidential administration, not the Biden one, the Trump one, played a big role in fostering where we are today as an Asian American community. I mean, we don't have to belabor the point of how he called it the China flu, the Kung flu, and all that kind of characterization of this worldwide pandemic and making it an ethnic issue and a racial issue when it really was a health issue that we needed to be pointing to. So the federal government certainly has its large share of that responsibility. However, that does not mean that we in the grassroots, that we, the people who are in a democracy, right, and have the power of the vote, have the power of other ways of having movements, we need to tell our stories. We need to build these bridges at the grassroots. Hate laws and anti-violence laws only go so far. They don't stop the violence on the street immediately, right? And I mean, and again, I'm a proponent of we need stricter laws and anti-hate laws and so forth. But I'm thinking of the long term. I'm thinking of how do we become a more perfect union? How do we become a more just union, not only in Washington, D.C., but among our true constituencies, our true people in the United States, that we understand what each other has done to make our nation as great as it is. And that's what I said in the PSA, for those of you who were here at the top of the presentation, that it's important that all of us tell our stories. White, black, brown, yellow, green, red, whatever our color, whatever our background, and not only based on ethnicity, but orientation, sexual orientation, gender, religion, and so forth, because we all have contributed to that. And when we as a nation can get to that point that we realize that our nation's history is multidimensional, multicultural, multicolored, and multi-everything, we will be a more perfect union. We will be a more just union.
Thank you, Mitch. I have Jeff, Dr. Jeff Sapp. Dr. Sapp, would you like to ask your question? You have 3 seconds to respond.
What's up, Jeff?
Jeff, are you there?
Yes, one moment.
Yeah, I think Jeff is here.
Yes.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead, Jeff. Ask your question, please.
Okay. Many of the anti-Asian hate crimes today are towards our elderly. Why do you think this is the case? And how do you care for those elderly who are a part of the Go for Broke Foundation family?
Great to see you, Jeff. We haven't seen each other face to face in over a year, but I think that today's anti-Asian hate is a conglomeration of a lot of different factors, and not the least of which is that we have individuals in the highest levels of government encouraging this type of behavior. Maybe not issuing a statement saying go out there and beat up elderly Asian people, but again, in their sentiments and in their comments, promoting the Asian Americans represent a threat. I also think, however, that there's a lot of mental illness that is tied into this. As I review the daily reports of people who have been attacked and who the perpetrators are, unfortunately, a lot of these individuals who are the perpetrators have other issues going on, drug issues, mental health issues. And so I think it's a reflection of the interconnectedness of a lot of our social issues right now. How do we take care of our elderly? You know, that is such a difficult question for us at Go for Broke National Education Center. Fortunately, if you're a Japanese American veteran, that means you're in your 90s now. These guys that we work with today, they're 95, 96. Some of them are 100 years old. I was on a phone call just Monday with one of our veterans, 100 years old, right? And that means if you're 95 to 100 and you're still kicking, you've got a good support system. You know, you live with your family, you live with, in the case of the 100-year-old, he lived with his 95-year-old wife who still took very good care of him, and they have a very good family structure. It's the elderly that don't have the family structure that I worry about. And certainly, you know, we talk with our other institutions as to how do we provide food, how do we, especially in this pandemic time, and how do we keep geographical blocks safe? Like, for example, we're located in Little Tokyo. How do we make sure that the Little Tokyo area is safe for our elderly to walk around? But the truth is, you can't provide 24/7 protection for every individual as we see. And the other truth is, it's not only the elderly who are being attacked now, it's you know, younger folks. And of course, when I see them saying that 60 years old is elderly, then I really have an issue with that, because that means I'm in that category now. But yeah, it is a challenge. It is a challenge. And I think what I would like to see happen out of all of this is that the protection of elderly Asians isn't just an Asian American community responsibility. That the protection of Black Americans is not just a Black American issue. The protection of gay, lesbian, transgender, and queer individuals is an issue for all of us to take to heart. And if there's any hope that I have out of seeing this and seeing our communities working together, it's that we need to understand it's not you that they're attacking, it's us.
Thank you, Mitch. Elise Gura has a comment, but I think she will frame it in a question as well. Elise, are you there? Don't let me down, Elise. I just spoke to you.
I just unmuted myself. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. And I think the connection relates to what Mitchell just said also, that at the basis, I think that this only stops when people look at each other as not the other, but the same. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the ways we get there is by conducting our lives together, when our children attend school with one another, when we bump into each other in the grocery store or the pharmacy, you know, those kinds of things. So we have to have more opportunities to be with one another, just as people, right? Working with one another, these kinds of things. So how do we create more opportunities like that? I mean, suddenly we're not going to change the housing situation, which we know is an issue. By the way, I live in Manhattan Beach, and I don't agree with what city council. I'm embarrassed by my city council and the Bruce's Beach issue, just so that you know that. I'm also aware of how Dodger Stadium was built by robbing Hispanic families of their homes. I mean, there are a number of these kinds of situations. So my question is, how do we create more opportunities for people to be with one another and see that we are not the other, we are the same?
Elise, I can't agree with you more. Yeah, thank you for saying what you just did. And I think the answer to your question of how do we create more opportunities, that's the answer. We create more opportunities. You know, whether it's through opportunities like this, where we get to share one another's story. And I would just add to your comment that we stop seeing each other as the other, right? That we are all Americans, we're all human beings. You know, but at the same time, we don't lose appreciation for the experiences that each other has gone through and the contributions that each other has gone through. So your comment about Dodger Stadium is so right on that, you know, people today don't know the pain and the suffering that went into Dodger Stadium. They just see this big, beautiful stadium and they think it's always been there and it's great, you know, type of thing. And yet people suffered for that, you know, and people lost so much and weren't compensated appropriately for what happened. And so I think the answer to your question is to make it a statement, which is we need to contribute. I mean, excuse me, not contribute. We need to create opportunities for that exchange and get outside of our bubbles, you know, and that's why at the top of the hour, I was talking about, is there a way that we can get students at Dominguez Hills, not only to talk to one another, you know, because again, I would argue that most of them think alike in some respect, but let's have them talk to somebody at the University of Alabama. You know, let's have them talk to someone in Tennessee. Let's have them talk to people in Michigan, you know, and so forth. That's where we need to start to have this dialogue. And that gets back to Gus's point about truth and reconciliation. Truth and reconciliation begins with communication. It begins with sharing the stories. And, you know, in truth, and I'm struggling to understand this more, I want to understand how it is that half the nation is so angry about that they want to build a wall around this nation, that they want to kick everybody out that doesn't look like them and so forth. You know, they must have a reason and we need to have this dialogue. You know, and so it goes both ways, you know, and to have that communication. But thank you for your comment. And let's all create these opportunities.
Wonderful. And Dr. DeLuca wrote on the chat, he agrees with Elise. If we could only get people to come to our theaters and hear each other's stories.
You know, let me comment on that. You know, Bill DeLuca, you are so right on because, you know, again, I'm saying here, I'm beating a dead horse. Let's tell our stories. What better way to tell the stories than through theater? You know, and in fact, at Go for Broke, what we're working on a documentary right now that hopefully will be carried, you know, by some major network or whatnot. But I mean, it's the telling of the stories, not only verbally like I just did, but through the arts, through theater. We just featured a young man, and this is something we might want to think about as a group, is Go for Broke just did an 8-minute piece on this young Japanese man. He's a hip hop artist, you know, and he raps about social ills, and he wrote a rap about the 442nd. And this is a way that he tells his story so that other young people, black, white, brown, yellow, all the different colors, you know, can hear it in their modern day language, you know, because they're not going to listen to Mitch Maki give a 40-minute presentation, you know, but they will listen to this 8-minute rap that our friend Kaze Jones did. And so, Bill, you keep doing your work too, you know, and promoting the theater.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Mitch. And I'm sure you remember Miguel Dominguez, our old friend. In fact, I haven't seen Miguel for many years. Miguel, you have the floor and welcome. Nice seeing you. Go ahead. You're muted, Miguel.
Miguel, ¿cómo estás?
Muy bien.
Oh, mi amigo.
I think you and I are the generation when in East LA, Japanese and Chicano students got together at Roosevelt High School and Salesian and so on. So we probably have some friends in common in our past. Nice to see you again.
But Miguel, I'm sorry, I got to tell this story for everybody.
Okay.
Because no, it's about the connection between the Latino community, the Mexican American community, and the Japanese American. And I still have the book that you gave me, How Baseball Saved Us, in Espanol. So you gave it to me as I was leaving Dominguez Hills, and I still treasure that. But anyway, we just did a story, and if you go to our website, it's called I Feel With My Heart. And there was a Japanese man this is pre-World War II, a Japanese man goes to Texas, meets a Mexican woman, they fall in love, and they have 7 children. They move back to Los Angeles in the 1930s, right? And the marriage falls apart. The Japanese guy goes back to Japan, but this Mexican woman is raising her 7 Mexican-American, Japanese-American children in Los Angeles. And they're growing up Mexican-American. They don't really identify with the Japanese side of them. World War II comes, and by the letter of the law, they should have all been shipped off to a camp, one of the concentration camps that I described. But because they were going by the last name Sosa, because they looked and could pass as Latino, and because they didn't identify as being Japanese American, they stayed in Los Angeles. So this family of 7 are some of the few individuals that we know that are Japanese American or part Japanese American that weren't sent off to camp. Anyway, 2 of the brothers joined the service and they joined under their last name Sosa. But my friend, still alive, Fernando Sosa Masuda, joins the army and see the Masuda name on his birth certificate. Next thing you know, he's in the 442nd because he's Japanese American, right? But he's not. He doesn't really understand the Japanese American culture because he never grew up that way. And he said he was a fish out of water, you know. And there's a wonderful story of how these 2 brothers, Japanese American brothers, approach him one day and they say, "Hey, you want to go on leave with us? We're going to go to Switzerland, you know, during our R&R." And he says, I don't got no money. I sent all my money home. So Fernando goes out, pulls his guard duty. When he comes back into the barracks, there's a pile of money on his bunk. And he says, "Who left this money? This isn't my money." And the brothers come up and they say, "Hey, looks like you got some money. Let's go to Switzerland." Off to Switzerland, they have the time of their life. And what we tell the story of how we reunited Fernando with one of the sons of one of those soldiers. So if any of you are interested in that story, go to our YouTube channel. YouTube, Go for Broke National Education Center. It's called "I Feel with My Heart," and it's a beautiful story of the connection between the Mexican American experience and the Japanese American experience. So, mi amigo, ¿tienes una pregunta?
Yeah, the question I have is I took my family to Manzanar some years ago, and I remember seeing, like, my memory's fading now. You have to excuse me, you know, it's la edad, as we say. And I thought I saw 2 signs. One, I think it was from the US government that called it a detention center. And another sign, I believe, from Japanese American group calling it a concentration camp.
Beautiful, yeah.
Days, how do you get it's like I have here, you know, I liberate, but you invade.
Yes.
I have gunslingers, but you're a gangbanger. I'm a pilgrim, but you're an illegal alien, right? And again, you know, I have a chemical dependency, you're an addict. How do you get around those semantics?
By telling our story in our voice. You know, and I think that's what's critical, is that when people tell their stories, they have to choose their words carefully and tell it in their voice. And thank you for bringing this up. If you listen to what I said carefully, you will hear that I don't use the word internment camp, because that was the official term.
That's right. The internment camp, correct, yeah.
Right. The Japanese American community, for the most part now, uses the term concentration camp, because that's what it is. That's what it was. It meets the definition of what a concentration camp was. And even Franklin Roosevelt used the term concentration camp. Now, when I say that, I am in no ways comparing what happened to Japanese Americans to what happened to Jews in Nazi Germany. I mean, I don't think any reasonable person makes that comparison. What happened to 120,000 people for 3 years versus the annihilation of 6 million individuals in Nazi Germany. But to be truthful, what did the Jews call those camps in Nazi Germany? They sometimes called the concentration camps, but they oftentimes called them death camps or extermination camps. And I think it's important that communities choose the words that actually depict what. I'll give you another example of a word that I don't use. I don't use the word evacuate. We were not evacuated from the West Coast. We were forcibly excluded at gunpoint to leave, right? And usually when you evacuate, it's for their own good. It's to bring them out of harm's way into safety. That was not the case. We were not given a choice, and we were forced to move that way. And the final thing I'll say about euphemisms or words that the government chooses versus what is reality. And I love your point about illegal alien versus pilgrim. I mean, it really brings the point to matter is that when those signs went up telling individuals of Japanese ancestry where they were to go to be shipped off to these camps, it said all individuals of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-aliens, are to report to a certain place. Well, we know what an alien is in this context. It's somebody from a different country. What's a non-alien? A citizen. But the government knew that they couldn't say all individuals who are US citizens of Japanese ancestry were about to ship you off to camp. So they created this euphemism of non-alien. So all of us on this call who are American citizens, the government will call us non-aliens when they're ready to send us off to camp. So your point is so right on, and I could talk about this for hours, that the words we choose to depict our reality and to share our experience are critical.
Thank you, Mitch. Those are really powerful answer, and the narrative is a very, very important to understand. Cheryl, would you ask your question or your comment?
I think, Mitch, that I want to honor you as being a perfect example of what you're talking about right now. For it says I'm getting a message there. For talking about creating a space or for people to be together. Because what most people don't know is for 12 years, I lobbied the university to represent Native Americans because we're supposed to be Dominguez Hills. And you were the first person. I went to the Asian Pacific Studies Committee meeting and said, this is probably not the appropriate venue. But the problem is there is no venue to represent Native Americans on this campus. And you were the first person that said, why don't we have a powwow? And I said, resources. You got other departments all across the campus to chip in and have that first Native American powwow. And what was truly amazing is when you looked at me and said, what is a powwow anyway? And we're now in our 10th year. Thank you, sir. You and the Indian community honored Mitch with a Code Talker Pendleton blanket, which
I still have and treasure.
Which is one of the highest honors that we can give you. Thank you.
Cheryl, no, thank you. I mean, you are an inspiration to me when I think about people who speak their truth and people who continue to do the work of sharing stories, and that's the part of Dominguez Hills that I miss. I love my job. And George Nakano, I see you on the call right now. I got to say this because George Nakano, who's also a big supporter of Dominguez Hills, George knows how much I love my job right now. I get to speak my truth every day. But, there are moments like this when Dominguez Hills is such a special place. And I will come back anytime, any day to speak, to be a part of the storytelling and the sharing amongst our students. And I still say our because you can't take Dominguez Hills out of me.
Thank you so much, Mitch. And we will invite you again and again until you get tired of us. I think you could see how much we really appreciate you. There are, I think Lisa is expected to ask a question. Some people from OLLI, if you have any questions. Nicole, would that be, I think you have a comment back there, Nicole. Would you like to ask your question or your comment? You're plugged.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining. Such a lovely conversation and a lively conversation. Thank you very much. This isn't your first time presenting to OLLI, is it, Doctor? You presented before.
I presented a few years ago, yes. Oh, you're on mute, Nicole. Yeah. Still on mute. There.
I was saying thank you. Wonderful. Any other comments? We're looking for any other comments. This is a time, we're at 11:23. We're closing at 11:30. 11:20 actually, in 10 more minutes. So please place your additional comments or questions in the chat or raise your hand. I'm looking.
Nicole, if I can just say a few closing comments then if there are no questions, and that is, I want to thank everybody. I see that there's about 60 of us, wow, 60 of us on this call, and we're all busy, we all have things to do. I want to thank you all. For the Korean scholars who have joined us, thank you for coming to Dominguez Hills and hearing our stories. And you all do such special work at Dominguez Hills. And I don't think you get to hear that every day. You don't understand, or you don't get to hear every day just how important the work of Cal State Dominguez Hills is. I mean, yeah, we're not Harvard in terms of, having the rich of the rich and the creme de la creme. We have the students that are going to make a difference in our society. We have that first generation college student, or maybe a second generation college student, who comes from the local communities, who's going to go back into the local communities to live oftentimes, and who carries the knowledge that you all are imparting to them. And really, you are touching the future in a way that unfortunately many of us won't see, because it will happen after we're all gone. But you are touching the future, and for that, I thank you. And I look to join you again in the future. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much, Mitch. I think Kathleen Hiroshima said spectacular as always. That's how she described your talk. And I share that with her and with everybody. Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll do it again. And I think Armand is going to take over for our Korean scholars. And Nicole, thank you so much for doing this with us. This will not be this is not our last one. I think we set a good example here, and we'll do it again. Mitch, again, thank you. Thank you, everyone. And until our next talk, which is May the 11th with the Korean Consul General, have a good day and be
and
safe.
this presentation is they can watch it on YouTube and share it, please. The link is there it is in the chat again.
Okay. Thank you, Nicole. Hema, thank you. And Armand, thank you very mumuch.
Bye-bye. And Anissa, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Maki, for coming.
Thank you. Domo arigato. Bye.